Hey, Michael here. We're on our way to Campfire Tales at Cuyahoga Valley National Park. I'm going to show you guys a little bit about some of the extra programs that our park offers out in Cuyahoga Valley. Campfire Tales is typically an event for kids that aims to teach them something. It's typically a group of actors that are really awesome. I don't know what they do outside of the Park Service, but they're all Park Service volunteers, and each story that they deliver is typically different and very interesting, and usually connotates some historical value to the area and the park. They've been kind of off the schedule for the last 5 or 6 months, and this is their first night back in a while. We're going over to Happy Days Lodge, right outside of Peninsula, right in Cuyahoga Valley Park, and we'll see what they have to deliver tonight. Alright, so here we are at the park, and we're across from Happy Days Lodge, where these Campfire Tales are typically held in the winter time, and we're gonna head down here, down the stairs ahead of me and through a tunnel which will take us under State Route 303 and over to Happy Days Lodge. And here's Happy Days Lodge. Obviously you can't see it too well, it's in the dark here. Beautiful facility, available for renting out for events. Lots of park events are here, especially in the colder weather. So here we are at Happy Days Lodge. Got the NPS Buffalo behind me, enjoying a nice warm fire in the fireplace over here. And got my daughter and all the Girl Scouts here ready for Campfire Tales.
Cuyahoga Valley National Park. I have been, I've been here with this. I've been with the National Park Service for a long time. I actually just taught a class at the Environmental Education Center, and the students in the class were interns. And I realized that I've been a park ranger longer than those interns have been on the planet. That was a little disconcerting. So, been here at Cuyahoga Valley National Park for quite a number of years. And in that time, I've learned a lot of great stories about Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Tonight, we're here to learn a little bit about some of the nice and the not so nice, the notorious, that were here in Cuyahoga Valley. To start with, does anyone know what this is? What is it? Quarter. You're close, it's a coin. It is a quarter. I'm not one of those that can take it and flip it and catch it and flip it and catch it. Maybe somebody else can do that, but I'm not quite so successful with that. What's on a quarter? Do you have a president's face? What are they doing when they flip the quarter at games? What are they trying to find?
I was going to see what's up there. American Eagles.
Sometimes they have American Eagles.
Heads and tails.
Heads and tails. Every coin has 2 sides. Every tail has 2 sides as well. We as people have a nice side. We also have a notorious side. Now, I'm a mom. I have a young man who's a little bit older than you young ladies. And I'm a nice mom when I bring home Taco Bell. I'm a notorious mom when I tell him to bring the garbage cans in and clean his room. So sometimes we are both nice and notorious. People I'm going to tell you about this evening, I don't think that they were evil. I don't think that they had bad intentions, but they were human. Sometimes the decisions we make are nice. Sometimes the decisions we make are not so nice. Now, the first gentleman But I'd like to tell you a few stories about tonight. There's probably the most notorious, probably also known as one of the nicest men here in Cuyahoga Valley. I'm going to actually read this because I can't remember all of these quotes. But let me tell you about what others said about this man. Accounts of his physical appearance reflect an almost awestruck admiration. A bystander at one of his many appearances described this man as a noble, a specimen of humanity as I ever gazed upon. Being over 6 feet high, with broad shoulders, ample chest, small waist, and elegant limbs. I've never heard that used to describe a man before, elegant limbs. He is indeed, in outward port and bearing, one of nature's noblemen. The resident of Akron recalled his deep-set, penetrating eyes and remembered how his height and girth gave him a personal presence that would attract attention in any company. He was intelligent, and in addition, he had a mildness of voice, along with the geniality of conversation that rendered him a most captivating companion. So this gentleman is considered one of the notorious, but that didn't sound like a description of a notorious person, did it? We actually have a picture. This is a copy, courtesy of the Peninsula Library and Historical Society, of this gentleman. So this was the early 1800s, 1830s. That's when this drawing was done. So imagine this gentleman being over 6 feet tall, and his eyes were blue, dark curly hair, slender, a charitable companion as he was called. Does anyone know who this gentleman might be? Jim Brown. This is Jim Brown. So this is an image of Jim Brown that was done of him when he was probably living in Akron. Now Jim Brown. Jim or John? It's Jim. John Brown was the one that was Harper's Ferry. He was managing sheep at the time for Simon Perkins. Related? Not that we know of. This Jim Brown actually came here in the early 1800s. He came with his father and his brother. They say his father, according to family records, his father was a Revolutionary War veteran. I did the math when they said his father was born, or when his father was, they had his birthday listed and his dates of service and stuff, but I did the math. His dad would have been in his 70s when he had Jim and Dan. So I'm not sure about the math there. I'm not sure if they have them confused, but anyway, they say his father was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. When he moved here, he soon attracted the attention of a young socialite here in Boston, and soon things got a little more heated. Eventually, he and his socialite married. In time, they would produce 4 children. I'm actually ahead of the story. I'm sorry. I'll back up. He married into a very well-to-do family in Boston, right here in the village of Boston. Have you ladies been to Boston?
Yes.
Trail mix? Had the ice cream? Here in Boston, Ohio, just to the north of the Peninsula. Now, believe it or not, there was a social circle there. And this young lady that was in the social circle, she was actually well known in Cleveland. She was educated and highly thought of. She married Jim Brown. She was the daughter of probably the only, she was the first doctor in Summit County. He wasn't in Summit County yet. But he was well thought of. She moved in circles in Cleveland. Jim Brown prevailed upon the in-laws to borrow a little money and set up a store on the west side of the Cuyahoga River. So this would be a little bit to the north. How many of you have been by the ski mill lately? Looking a little sad right now. But there's the train station. This would have been a little bit to the, the south of where the train station is now. So a little bit closer. set up a store. He was doing quite well at the store. One day while he was at the store, he was still a very young man, not been very long. He's standing at the front door of the store on the porch, watching a storm come in. You ever watched a thunderstorm come in? What happens when there's a thunderstorm? What does it do? Rumbles, you get thunder, and if you got thunder, you got lightning. So he's watching. And all of a sudden, there's a clap, and Jim Brown is hit by lightning. He is hit so hard by a direct blast that it sends him flying out into the yard. It renders him senseless and clothesless. Completely blew his clothes off of him, laying in the front yard. It took him a little while for his senses to come back to him. Eventually they did, and he did recover. Now I did tell you that the store was on the west bank of the Cuyahoga River, correct? So meanwhile, shortly after he set this store up, there's rumors of something that's going to be coming through the village of Boston, and heading through Peninsula, and heading to Akron. And eventually that thing is going to go all the way down to the Ohio River, going from the Ohio River to Lake Erie. This thing called the Ohio and Erie Canal. When Jim Brown realizes that this is indeed happening, that the canal is coming, he takes his store, prevails upon the in-laws to give, loan, sell him some land right next to their house, sets his store down on the east side of the Cuyahoga River to take advantage of the traffic. So the canal was built, canal comes through. Now, we all know that the people on the canal are fine, upstanding, non-notorious characters, right? You ever heard stories about Peninsula and how rowdy it was when the canal came through? That was also sometimes kind of true. See, I'm choking her up. Man, must have a personal story about their rowdiness. So, those rowdy canalers were coming right through Boston as well. And at 6 feet, over 6 feet, being broad of shoulder, ample of chest, small of waist, elegant of limb, sometimes Jim Brown had to press himself into service to control those rowdy canalers. And he soon became known as a champion wrestler and fighter. As a matter of fact, he said the only one that could ever lay him out was the Almighty himself, referring back to the lightning strike. After the lightning strike, after he moved his store to the east side, people started noticing some things about the store. But, you know, there's prosperity. Things are happening in Boston. Why, they're building warehouses and blacksmith shops and boatyards. And then Jim Brown is building a hotel. Interestingly enough, Jim Brown's in-laws did not give him land to build a hotel on. They gave his wife the land to build the hotel on. That seems kind of strange, but they gave him land, they gave the wife, in the wife's name, land across from their store, and they built a fine 2-story hotel, Jim Brown's commercial hotel. Interestingly enough, as that hotel was being built, there was also another building being built right next door to it, and the two buildings looked remarkably alike. They had porches, they had windows that were similar, they were both made in the Greek Revival style. Unfortunately, today only one of those buildings survived, and it's not Jim Brown's store, or Jim Brown's hotel. The one that is surviving was the one that was built at the same time, Boston Land and Manufacturing Company store. Maybe some of you know it today as Boston Store Visitor Center. So where his hotel was is where Indy Garage is now. So don't imagine a brick mortar cement block building. Imagine a 2-story white hotel instead. Now, people thought highly of Mr. Brown. Why, if you needed anything, say you weren't feeling well, and the hay had to come in, he'd send a group of men to help you bring in your hay. Or say you were under the weather, maybe, don't climb up on the roof, okay? Maybe you fell off the roof and you were going to be sick for a long, they would come help take you, he'd send folks down to help take care of your farm. He was a very congenial neighbor to have. But people started noticing something. Sometimes Jim Brown would be gone for a day or 2, 3, 4, or more. They started noticing that people were coming to the back doors of the store and the hotel. They were really nicely dressed gentlemen, dressed up to the minute in fashion. Men that were wearing the latest coats and cuts and hats and boots. Ladies, you realize that the men were the ones that wore the high heels prior to the Civil War? So they were well-heeled men. So they're coming to the back door. But you know, hey, it's Jim Brown. Then early one morning, Jim Brown sees, maybe he was gone a day or 2, no one can really be sure. One morning, Jim Brown is up at the crack of dawn, and he is cutting wood, chopping it up with an axe. And then he stops, and he goes and he knocks on his neighbor's door. I'm sorry, do you have the time? She looks back at a clock somewhere in the house. Why, Mr. Brown, it's 7:30. Oh, I'm so glad. I'm sorry, I just suddenly thought it might be much earlier, and I was afraid I might wake you up. I wasn't sure of the time. And she goes, oh, Mr. Brown, we've been up for a while. And he was, oh, I'm so glad. I didn't look at the clock, and I just started chopping the wood. So he went back to chopping the wood. And that afternoon, in rode into town a posse of strangers. Men with guns. Men that were looking for Jim Brown. They found Jim Brown, and they were going to arrest Jim Brown. They were going to arrest Jim Brown for counterfeiting. He wrote a bad check in Pittsburgh. They hauled him down to the judge in Akron. They wanted to take this man back to Pittsburgh and prosecute him for writing a bad check. Well, when did he write the check? Why, yesterday, Your Honor. How did people travel in the early 1800s? Do you know how they got around? Do you know what they rode on? Horses. Now, do you think a horse can go very far, very fast? Sometimes, maybe, but it takes us 2 hours by car to get to 2.5, depends on who's driving, to get to Pittsburgh now. But in those days, forget the 2 hours, it's like a 2-day journey. So when these men told the judge, why, he wrote that check yesterday, the judge kind of looked at him. Today we go say, what? The judge looked at it, and then soon enough, Jim's like, there must be some mistake. Why, I was here, and I was chopping my wood this morning, and my neighbor can testify that I was here chopping wood this morning because I had to ask her what time it was. So they go back to Boston, they get the neighbor, they bring her down, and she testifies in court. Like 7:30 this morning, he was here chopping wood. So Jim Brown was released because there was no physical way that you could ride a horse from Pittsburgh to Boston here in the valley overnight. It's a good thing maybe they didn't look at the barn, because they might have seen an extremely exhausted horse. It seems that Jim Brown a few days before had gone to Pittsburgh, but along the way, every 50 miles or so, he'd stashed a horse. And then he did write a check in Pittsburgh. Left town, by the time they discovered it, they came out after him in hot pursuit, but he had been riding full tilt. Got to the first stop, changed out his tired horse for a fresh horse, got on, went the next 50 miles. stopped at the next stop, changed his tire doors and kept going all night until he got home. No one thought it was physically possible to do that. Well, that was the first sign to the neighbors that maybe Jim's not as nice as he seems. Eventually, Jim decided that he was going to take what money he did have. He was going to go down to New Orleans, make his fortune. So he and his brother, Dan, went down to New Orleans. And it seems that they brought a few things with them, like engraving plates and a printing press. Jim Brown was a counterfeit. I'm going to back up for a minute. You ladies all know what a dollar bill looks like, right? Now, if you had a dollar bill and you had a dollar bill, would your dollar bills look alike? Would your dollar bill look like their dollar bill? How about yours? Probably. Because they all say Federal Reserve note on them, right? Well, back before the Civil War, back before the Civil War, actually the era of Andrew Jackson did not renew the charter for the National Bank, which put the banking industry into disarray, and what resulted is that the Bank of Paul printed its own money. The Bank of Liz printed her money. All $100 bills. Meanwhile, the Bank of Rebecca, well, actually, I don't believe in banks, so I'm going to print anti-banking notes, which is what some people did. And then you had a whole group, there was actually an anti-banking group in Kirtland that would print money that had absolutely no bank to back it up. And it seems that somehow Mr. Brown would acquire these plates. He took some of these plates, he went to New Orleans with his brother, they printed money, and they were exchanging their money for goods, which they were putting on the ship. They were going to sail a ship to China, trade their goods off, bring them back, and make their fortune that way. However, let's just say that luck didn't hold out. The authorities got wind of their little scheme, and they were arrested. Put into jail. Eventually, in time, news reached Boston, and in time, a year later, finally Jim Brown was released. Unfortunately, due to the conditions of the jail in New Orleans at the time, Dan Brown did not make it out. He had the misfortune of passing away in New Orleans' finest establishment. So Jim Brown made it out, made the long journey back up to Boston. Why? This is all a terrible misunderstanding, you understand. I don't know why would they have thought that? He returned to Boston, and people were so happy to see him back in his store again that they promptly elected him Justice of the Peace. And actually, the Summit County Sheriff at the time said that he fulfilled that duty with remarkable faithfulness. Eventually, his ways did catch up to him. Eventually, he was convicted of counterfeiting. He was sent to the state reformatory just outside of Columbus. The warden actually made a reference in later years, and there was a biography that was done. Sam Lane did 50 years in Summit County, and he spoke to the warden, and the warden recorded that when Jim Brown had to take his normally elegantly dressed fashionable clothes and exchange it for the prisoner's stripes, he had never seen a man so stricken and mortified as that. So there was Jim Brown at the state reformatory. Time passed. Anybody ever heard stories about Mansfield Prison or seen some of the conditions in mid-19th century reformatories? This is not the Hilton Inn. This is not the Hilton Garden Hotel. This isn't your Days Inn or your Holiday Inn or your Super 8. disease you want to take home. Cholera in 19th century, this is the gross part, sorry. Cholera in 19th century slang was called the bloody flux. You literally couldn't keep fluid in your body. And here was Jim Brown with this cholera epidemic breaking out all around him. People were sick. People were dying. And here was Jim, bringing water, bringing food, bringing a blanket, comforting someone. He was in the hospital working tirelessly, day in and day out, with all of this going on around him. The epidemic went on for several days, and he was everywhere, helping different inmates, helping people get them water, trying to do what he could. Shortly after the epidemic subsided, the warden got a letter. A very official letter. A very official letter from a place called Federal City. And we don't have, well, we do have Federal City today, but we call it by a different name. We call it Washington, D.C. And this very important looking letter had a seal on it. And when he opened the letter up, the letter was signed by none other than President Zachary Taylor. And it was a presidential pardon for Jim Brown due to the tireless efforts during the cholera outbreak. So the warden released him, and Jim Brown came home. The funny thing is, you go through the papers of President Zachary Taylor and his list of presidential pardons, there's no presidential pardon listed for a James Brown from Boston, Ohio. So, behind every man there's a... This is the woman that Jim Brown married. Her name was Lucy Mather. Anybody ever heard of the Mather family? She was a socialite. Now, we can't tell today. She was also blue-eyed, dark hair, but this was the height of fashion in the 1830s. The whitest of lace, the finest of wools and gabardines. She has a brooch. She has the latest in fashions around her head. This was a woman of means. Not a large woman, not a tall woman, on the small side. But a woman, yes, she's nice and pleasant looking, but she's a woman to be reckoned with. Did she know about her husband's doings? She lives with him. Stephen Mims seems to think that she was a partaker with him, that she knew about his dealings in Quebec, because he was wanted in Quebec for dealing in counterfeit. He was wanted in Boston for dealing in counterfeit. The other Boston, Massachusetts. He was wanted in Pittsburgh, obviously. He was wanted in St. Louis. He was wanted in New Orleans. This man got around. Did she know about it? More than likely. Now, according to family legend, when Jim Brown was arrested in New Orleans, this tiny little finely dressed woman, according to family legend, got on a horse and rode to New Orleans. How do you get to New Orleans in the 1830s? You travel through what is now another national park site called Natchez Trace. This is where every scalawag in the country hung out. She probably didn't travel alone. She probably went with some of Jim Brown's henchmen. But she got there and she stayed by his side. She arranged for witnesses. She would go into the prison, the jail to bring things to her husband, to talk about the case, to try to arrange for witnesses to come and testify of his fine, upstanding character. Oddly enough, one of the witnesses for this particular case disappeared and shows up a few years later in Missouri. Eventually, Jim Brown was acquitted in New Orleans due to lack of evidence because at one point, one witness turns on another, Jim Brown turns on the witnesses. It got to be a he say, she say mess that nobody could untangle. Looks small, looks daintily dressed, but a woman who had her own side. You're right. There's actually a few women here in the valley that had their own strong backbone, that were nice, to a point maybe. One of those women had the name of Elizabeth. Yeah, be afraid right there. We have Elizabeth back here, but don't call her that. It's Liz. This was an Elizabeth Hyden or Hinton. She was she was close to middle age, early middle age, when she had the misfortune of losing her husband in 1865. I don't know how he passed away, but she lost her husband. And she went on to run the family farm in Valley here. She ran with one of her son-in-laws. She ran that farm so well that it became one of the largest and most productive farms in the Valley View area. She produced she didn't, her farm did, 500 pounds of butter in 1 year. That's a lot of butter. She's selling it. That comes out of the agricultural product listing. So there's stuff like she's got a very productive farm. She was a very influential woman, large farm. She must have had a notorious side also because when her husband passed away and she's turning this farm into the other kids that she had, her other children, took her to court and sued her over the farm and not getting their inheritance. There are other strong women in the valley. I apologize, this is a digital copy. This is a woman who was a shaker and a mover in Brecksville. If you lived in Brecksville in the late 1800s and you wanted to plant flowers in the town square, it has to go through Emily Wallace. Oh, we need a new town hall. It has to go through Emily Wallace. It wasn't always that way. When Emily first married, her husband was a canal boat captain. Canal boat captains are not known for being on the top of the food chain. Her husband decided at some point that he didn't like this traveling up and down the canal. He didn't like hanging out with little brownie canalers. So he bought a farm. They were farming, very middle and successful, and then, I guess what happened to Mrs. Wallace? She lost her husband. Now she's a widow. She continues to run the farm with the help of some good farm hands. And then a neighbor wound up needing some funds. He was in debt and he needed some assistance. He borrowed money from Mrs. Wallace, but he didn't have any money to pay her back, so he put up a few acres of his farm as collateral. Know where that story's going? She got some acres of land. So now she has a bigger farm. Other people need money. They come to her, they borrow money. Now she has more land, or more farm, or more money, or she makes the money back and gets the interest. She was a woman to be reckoned with. Nice? Or maybe notorious too. So we have all kinds of characters throughout the valley. We've been talking about the 19th century.
Watching. Look for more videos soon. Please subscribe and like below. See you next time.